What's happening, everybody? Ian O'Neill here with the main man himself, Paul Brown, and we're going to talk about UFC Kansas City. Obviously, a lot of Irish interest this weekend on a certain Cage Warriors card that will take place in Dublin. That happens during the day. It really whets the appetite and will flow nicely into this UFC Kansas City card, where we also, Paul, have a bit of Irish interest at the top of the card. Business is a booming in Irish mixed martial arts right now. It's great to see. Obviously, a man who has made his way and forged his path through the Cage Warriors ranks, becoming the Cage Warriors welterweight champion before moving over to the UFC. Finds himself at another last-minute fight against Carlos Prates in your main event at 170 pounds. Anthony Smith versus Mingyang Zhang is your co-main event. Giga Chikadze versus David Onama, Michel Pereira versus Abus Magomedov, and Randy Brown, Nicholas Dalby. Is Ikram Alishkarov versus Andre Muniz feeds up the 6-fight main card. And, as you work your way down through that card, Paul, it's a pretty decent card overall. Obviously, we'll talk about the main event in a minute, but, we could be doing worse. We were seeing a kind of a stage of UFC cards where you have got your Apex cards, you've got these fight nights cards in front of a crowd, and we've got the pay-per-view cards, obviously. And as UFC standards of cards go, this is a pretty good one for a fight night card.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that they do. This is their protocol for when they're going in front of a live audience. Obviously, the big hitters are reserved for the pay-per-view cards, but when they're going to somewhere like Kansas City, they're at T-Mobile Center in Kansas City now, which incidentally is not in Kansas. I did not know that until this week.
Yeah.
This was news to me. I saw Laura Sanko posting that, so that was news to me.
There's two places in the States, Paul, that I always get confused, and that is Kansas and then Kansas City. And then there's also Washington State and then Washington's
DC. Not in Washington State, though.
Yeah, exactly. You can easily confuse it. Those old Yanks, they'll always keep us guessing on the geography side of things anyway.
This is it. And look, they're in front of a live audience, which I love, because the energy on these cards is always amazing. But they have a habit of kind of putting in fun fights. They'll match up guys that are known for putting on good performances, and that's what they've done this weekend. When you go through some of the guys on that main card, some of the matchups, really, really exciting fights. Obviously, most of the like ranked names and the guys that are up in title contention, like I said, kept for the pay-per-view cards, and there are some big ones on the horizon, but there's a handful of guys here that you can nearly guarantee are going to give you some fun fights. So I'm looking forward to catching up on some of these fights.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Let's get into it in the main event. Obviously, Machado Gary against Carlos Prates, a fight that, just materialized a couple of weeks ago. Another quick turnaround for Ian Gary here. He's a fan of taking short notice fights. And I mentioned it on the big podcast with Shawnee this week, and I'm curious to get your perspective as well. The change in mentality from Ian Gary, a guy who came up, Paul, very detailed in his approach, very methodical in what he wants to do and creating game plans and going out there and kind of, that kind of top heavy approach where you're really concentrating and focusing on your opponent and building a game plan to beat them was something that really got Ian Gary to the dance in the UFC and in the early stages of his UFC career. Well, in his last two fights, Shavkat Rakhmonov has been on short notice. This one too has also been on short notice. So he's completely flipped the script here in terms of, his belief, I think, in his skill set, that he wants to take these kind of fights at short notice. Maybe it adds that extra bit of pressure. Something that Ian Gary is very good at doing, and we know this is fighting under extreme levels of pressure. We've seen that many times in his career. What do you think about the shift in mentality and maybe, for lack of a better term, a shift in approach in him wanting to take these kind of fights at short notice against, very dangerous guys like Carlos Prates and Shavkat Rakhmonov in his last outing?
I think when Ian first came into the UFC, he was very open about wanting to learn. And, he's always been a guy who has serious belief in his own abilities and whatnot. And he went off to Killcliff and he was openly speaking about, maybe being humbled a little bit at times on those mats. And he's I think, reached a point now in his UFC career where he's racked up enough experience against the right type of fighters, the right level of fighters. He's built up enough trust in what he brings to the table to realize now that he can back himself. He's put himself and tested himself with on the training mats and in the octagon against a variety of different types of fighters, guys at different levels. And I think he just now backs his own capabilities to get the job done, no matter who he's facing. I think he's a guy now who knows who he is, knows what he wants to do in this sport. We saw him take the short notice fight against Shavkat. And I mean, there's the big question when someone takes a short notice fight. When we look at this fight this weekend, obviously Prates had been training to fight Jeff Neal on UFC 314, which was 2-3 weeks back. That fight, of course, got cancelled. Neal pulled out. And everyone is kind of saying in the lead up to this fight, you know, Ian Garry has stepped in at a couple of weeks' notice to fight him. It's a big move, blah, blah, blah. Here's the thing. Jeff Neal is a southpaw, and Carlos Prates would have been preparing to fight him. And his whole camp would have been centered around things that'll work in that sort of open stance position, that close stance position against a fellow southpaw. He now has to just kind of go back to basics really with his training, or, you know, all of the tactical stuff they would have spent that time working on. All the technical stuff now, it's kind of just gone out the window, and now he's going to circle back to maybe doing things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
We have seen Ian Garry come in at the drop of a hat against the toughest matchup in the division and go for 5 rounds and look good for 5 rounds. So we know for a fact, I mean, this can be verified. Ian Garry is capable of stepping in there on short notice against the elite fighters in the division and performing to his best and giving them hell. So to think that he wouldn't be in a position now to do that against Carlos Prates, I think that's foolish. I think he trusts himself. He knows, having faced 3, I think it was 3 or 4 southpaws already in his UFC career.
D-Rod was a southpaw as well. I think Jeff Neal is a southpaw, if I remember correctly.
Yes, Gabe Green as well.
Yeah, you know, so it is something that he's used to as well, and you know, it's something that I kind of taken heed to as well. And a lot of the plaudits that he got for that performance against Shavkat, what was kind of lost in the crosshairs is exactly what you said. Was the performance that he put on against Shavkat was on 2.5 weeks' notice. He's giving himself an extra week here now, so he might be able to go 10 rounds, giving himself an extra week. But you know, I do not think that, you know, it's a risk. It's always a risk coming in at short notice. But is it a worry risk that he might not perform to the levels that he could? I don't think so, because I think you said it exactly as it is. I think he showed us against Shavkat Rakhmonov that he can come in and he can deliver and he can withstand and he can set a pace over 5 rounds, you know, on any type of notice. And I think I'm very curious to hear the nitty-gritty side of this and what you think from an analytical perspective, because I truly feel the pace that is set in this fight is going to be hugely important. If we were to kind of, you know, look at both of these guys, Ian Garry can be, you know, he can pick up a slow approach, but he can pick it up as the fight goes on. Carlos Prates does kind of have that slow kind of Muay Thai slow movement. I called him a snake charmer on the big podcast this week, where he kind of will lure his opponents into the pace that he wants to fight, you know, and suits him best. And it's a very good skill to have. And it's up to Ian Garry here, Paul, not to really fall into that trap. And one thing that he said in the Shavkat Rakhmonov fight is that he wished he could have given should have given a little bit more in the early stages. So I'm wondering, will we see Ian Garry start this fight guns a-blazing? And I think it's going to be very important in his route to victory that he does start fast here against a guy like Carlos Prates.
Absolutely. I think that's going to be the biggest factor in this fight. The big difference here between these two men, not just as fighters, but as athletes, there's quite a startling difference. Carlos Prates, it's a joke, you know, everyone's going along with it. Carlos loves to smoke cigarettes and he lives the Nakmoy lifestyle and whatnot, and he's making jokes there over the last couple of weeks that he'd prefer to be fighting 3-round fights rather than 5-round fights. Like I just mentioned, Ian Garry can get off the sofa with a few days' notice and go 5 rounds with the best fighters in the world. We know he can do that. Carlos Prates hasn't really had to do it yet, and he hasn't been in there with somebody who's going to drag him into deep waters. He hasn't been in there with a guy who can maybe pinpoint his weaknesses in the stand-up game, in the striking game, and there are a couple which I'll get into shortly. But if anybody in the division can do it, I think Ian Garry absolutely has the skill set to do it. And one of the ways he's going to do that is to get him fighting on the back foot, which is where he's truth be told, I mean, Carlos Prates does a lot of things brilliantly. Like if you look at it from a technical, analytical point of view with his striking, a lot of the stuff is to be admired. It's exceptional. Like he has close to 100 Muay Thai fights. But one glaring thing that stands out to me about his striking, when you watch back some of his pre-UFC fights, is that he does not look comfortable when he's being made to fight on the back foot. There's a big difference between fighting in a ring with ropes and fighting in a cage. And it absolutely plays a part in how you defend barrages of punches. And then when I watch back Ian Gary's fight with, let's say, a Gabe Green, who of course is not on the same level as Carlos Prates when it comes to striking, but a lot of the stuff that he used, some of the blitzes, the knee up the middle, things like that, just to get his opponent moving backwards, you could see those things coming into play here. And he's going to pinpoint the weaknesses for sure. I think there's a stark contrast in how these two guys play the game. And I think we're about to see Ian Gary show us exactly how good he is when it comes to going toe-to-toe with an elite striker like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was kind of going to lead me around to the next question I was going to ask you. And that is the approach of Ian Gary against a guy like Carlos Prates, who's obviously, very dangerous on the feet. And I'm not saying this by any means with any doubt that I don't think that Ian Gary could not hang with him. I think he definitely does hang with him from a technical standpoint. He's a much more technical fighter. His shot selection is much better. His accuracy is pretty good as well. Solid jab for Ian Gary coming in here as well. Is that the route you start off with in this fight, Paul? Or, obviously much was said about the picture that's in Ian Gary's bedroom right now of him almost finishing the rear naked choke against Shavkat Rakhmonov. Does he come in here and does he use a grappling heavy approach to try and wear down Carlos Prates? I mean, he has a couple of different avenues, does he? And I think, the avenue for Carlos Prates is straight stand-up. He's got to keep it there. I know he's not really known as a grappler. I can't imagine he would be too comfortable in those grappling exchanges. And imagine he's going to be wanting to separate and strike. With Ian Gary, he has a couple of different approaches. He can tackle it on the feet. Obviously, that's going to be a higher risk for him. But he also has those takedowns and obviously that submission game in his back pocket too. What do you expect to see happening there when the both guys clash on Saturday night?
I think Ian having that ability that we now know he has as a grappler who can impose himself on the best guys in the UFC's welterweight division, having that at least as a threat, it adds an extra wrinkle to the threat that he brings to Carlos Prates. And it's going to make Prates have to worry about him coming in and approaching things that way too. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he went in and practically wore a singlet and wrestling boots and really went to physically impose himself on Prates. One thing that stands out to me when you look at the two fighters is, like, Prates is a tall, sort of long, almost slender guy at the weight class, and he's generally that bit longer than a lot of the guys he fights. But Ian Gary's taller than him and has a reach advantage as well. So Ian is also that little bit broader. I think that it's going to be a kind of a slightly noticeable physicality difference between the two, and I think Ian's going to maybe try and wear on Carlos, so as well as getting him moving backwards, make him work, make him drain him, do a Shavkat to him and really push him up against the fence. I think that'll be part of the game plan. Whether he can get him down or not is a different thing, because as I mentioned, Carlos Prates is very tall. If you look at his build, the sort of unorthodox thing about his build is that his legs are very, very long. Like his hips come up quite high, don't they? When you look at him,
gangly would be the word that would come to mind. If
he's not quite Sean Woodson, but he does certainly have sort of abnormally longish legs, in comparison to,
which also could be targeted too, Paul, by Ian. We've seen him coming out there with a calf kick heavy game against a guy like Neil Magny, and the stance and as you mentioned, the stature of his body, it does leave Carlos Prates open for a couple of leg kicks there as well.
It does, and with the two of them in opposing stances, obviously the outside calf kick isn't there, but the inside one is, and that's a weapon that Prates loves. Like he really goes to town on that. What he's very good at is staying light on his lead leg. So you'll notice he kind of does two slightly different stances when he fights, because he likes to sort of sit in the space in front of you and work from there, maybe try to counter you from there. He's good at fighting kind of with his feet slightly widened base, hands down. He's good at rolling with shots. Pull counters are brilliant. So he's very good at leaning back, so he can be heavy on that back leg, and then he throws that pull counter. But what he also does sometimes is bring his feet that little bit narrower and just tap the lead foot. You know, that traditional Muay Thai tap. So he'll bring the hands up and he'll tap the lead foot. So hitting him with calf kicks can be difficult because he's in a great position there to check. And that's why he's then so good at catching or dishing out the calf kicks from there, the inside leg ones, to fighters like Ian, who will be in the opposing stance. But the issue with that type of stance in mixed martial arts, you can do it in Muay Thai because you'll generally stand in front of each other and let your weapons fly at each other. If you do this in mixed martial arts a hell of a lot, you're heavy on that back leg. You're very, very easy to drive back to the fence or to even shoot takedowns on. Now, he hasn't, like I said, come up against someone who has the well-roundedness or the overall skill set to impose themselves on him in that way. And I think if anybody in the division can do that, Ian Garry certainly falls into that category.
Definitely, you know? I can definitely see that being put to the test on Saturday night for sure. Like, yeah.
And there's the other thing as well with the long legs is when you're against the fence, you're clinched up against the fence. You'll know this from doing that's a very tough position, isn't it? When you're against the fence and you're trying to get someone, you're doing wall work.
Oh, 100%.
A big part of getting someone down is lifting their knee, lifting their leg that little bit higher than their hips, and then their balance just becomes it's off, you know. So that's why sprawling obviously helps and spreading your base helps to kind of keep your base there against the wall. But when someone has really long legs or their hips are quite that little bit higher up, it becomes trickier to get them to get their leg up. So that's why we haven't really seen him taken down much against the fence. Now again, Ian being that little bit taller, maybe that just negates that a little bit and makes it a little easier for Ian.
I can kind of see an approach. What you said is 100% right there too. I couldn't agree more. For Ian, I think the approach to try and get the fight down is probably a body lock, inside trip, kind of leg drag, something like that. You know, something where, you know, he might not necessarily get a power takedown or, a double leg takedown or even a single leg takedown. It might be a thing where he has to just maybe try and trip him, use that upper body strength to kind of take him off balance. And then, you know, create a scramble where Ian can either look to get to the side control. But I think exactly what Ian is going to try and do here eventually, Paul, is try and create a scramble against the fence to try and take the back of Carlos Prates, a position that he's found himself in many a times, but has been unable to finish. No submissions in his career yet. You know, when you're looking at that position for Ian Garry, what were some of the things that he did wrong, and what are some of the things that he would need to correct? Because I have a real good feeling he has a point to prove here. And if I could, I'm definitely going to be betting on Ian Garry to win by submission. If I could bet on Ian Garry to win by a rear naked choke, I'd do exactly that as well. I think he's going out there with an egg in his arse to try and prove that he can get that finish from that position. As a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, as a guy who knows exactly what to do in that situation, what does he need to do? I know it's a little bit different when you have the gloves on and everything like that in mixed martial arts, but there's some minor corrections there, you know, in terms of grip, etc., that Ian would probably be looking towards to try and improve to get that submission this time around.
I actually spoke to Ian exactly about this. So I think I shared a little clip of it on my Instagram back in like December or January, because I was writing a feature about him. So I didn't kind of air the whole interview, but we went off on a little, two of us just went off on a little kind of tangent about details. So we talked about this, and I had basically myself and we're in the gym, and Andy Ryan was basically, we were sitting down going through that exact position and you know what could have been done differently and whatnot. I didn't tell Ian, I didn't open up to him about that sort of stuff. But what I did was I asked him if he had spoken to Charles Oliveira because they'd linked up, or sorry, it was Damien Maya. They had linked up in the UK at one of his seminars, and I said, listen, did you talk to him about what you could have done differently against Shavkat? So he was like, yeah, it was the head position. So he's basically got the arm around for the rear naked choke, and what's happening then is he wants to pull the arm deeper. Now, Ian pointed out a great little detail to me that I think Charles Oliveira had showed him, was you can grab your own glove in MMA. You cannot grab your opponent's glove, but you're allowed to grab your own. So when he had the arm around the neck, he grabbed the cup of his own glove and peeled it and pulled the choke arm deeper. But what he did then was he lifted his head up on top of of Shavkat Rakhmonov and was trying to crush from there. Whereas what he needs to do in that position is to bring his ear to ear with his opponent, and that what that does is it compresses the space a lot more. The choke sinks in just that micro millimeter deeper.
Yeah.
And the thing that stuck out to me that he told me that day was, he said, I am going to become obsessed now with this specific choke. This is my training goal for the foreseeable future. He's going to go off and learn the Mata Mayao, the Maya Mayao, which is or Maya Leao and the Mata Leao. So the Maya Leao is a Damien Maya sort of variation on it. And he said he was basically just going to spend all day, every day, just drilling different ways of getting in and out of it, going through to it from different places, and a selection of different finishes. So, like you mentioned, the idea there popped into my head right there and then. The next time Ian Gary fights, I am absolutely going to throw a couple of quid on him to catch a submission victory.
For sure,
worth
man.
a shot.
Yeah, and he's got Damien Maya in the corner as well this weekend as well, which will kind of further cement that kind of thought process. But it'll be interesting to see if he can do it. Look, I said I'd keep you 25 minutes. We've done that alone on Ian Gary's fight.
I could probably do an hour talking about this fight.
I know,
I'm so
both,
intrigued
man.
by the matchup.
You and me both. It's fascinating. It's great to see an Irishman, of course, at the top of the UFC card as well. Well, let's move down and we'll touch on a couple of the rest of the fights, Paul. Co-main event. I mean, this is, what is Anthony Smith doing? I think I've had this conversation time and time again. I think he's calling this his retirement fight. Hopefully this is the last time. He doesn't know.
59 fights deep enough. This is his 59th MMA fight.
Crazy. He'll definitely look to try and get to 60 after this too. So hashtag MMA retirements.
Look forward to his next one.
Yeah, as you do. This one can, this guy that he's fighting here is a tough little test for him. He's a guy that's got big power. Is multiple first round ground and pound finishes, and he can cause Anthony Smith some trouble here. It's his third fight in the UFC after coming off the road to the UFC event, and this is a big jump up in competition in certain regards. But Anthony Smith is somewhat at the end of his tether and is kind of there to be got at this stage. So is the UFC trying to set this guy up with a name to get a win? That's what it looks like from me from the outside in. And, I'm sure by the way you're reacting here too and what I'm saying, you're kind of feel the same.
Yeah, Mingyang Zhang, 18-6, 18 first round finishes.
Insane.
That's nuts. He's also been finished 6 times, so he's never seen a judge's scorecard.
I think I remember. It's very hard to remember some of the fighters as well, but I remember when I talked about this guy is like when you're literally talking about a guy with a kill or be killed mentality. That's what Mingyang Zhang has coming in here. And that kind of his record suggests that it's either a first round win by knockout or a first round loss. He's 1 second round submission loss, and that was the very first fight of his career. So this guy is a fucking finisher, and that should probably get excited alone, but you don't really want to see Anthony Smith catching too bad of a beating here.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at their recent fights, like obviously Mingyang, I watched his fight against Brenjison Ribeiro, and you could see why he's been knocked out a bunch of times. So he knocked him out in like a couple of minutes flat, but he took quite a few shots himself. He just gets straight into a firefight, and he's a hulk of a man. Like he's 6'2", which I suppose isn't ginormous for a light heavyweight, but the thickness in in his arms and legs, and he looks like anytime he catches someone clean, they go out. When you watch Anthony Smith's most recent fight against Dominic Reyes, now Dominic Reyes, I have to say, looked excellent in that fight. That was only in December. And I think Anthony Smith was going through, wasn't it? His coach had recently died. So he was in absolutely no headspace there to be fighting. And Dominic Reyes finished him. But if you look at some of the shots he took in the first round, if Mingyang Zhang hits him with those shots, it's going to be lights out. So he will have to raise his performance level significantly this weekend in comparison to his most recent fights. He's lost 3 of his last 4. So a lot of mileage on that clock. He's been in a lot of fights. He's only in the UFC since 2016, so not even 10 years in the UFC, and he's had a hell of a lot of fights. So he's just been around the world quite a few times in the octagon, and I think that mileage is going to pay off. Is going to show if Mingyang Zhang gets hands on him this weekend.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that assessment as well. It'll be interesting to see. I'd probably be as confident of a Zhang knockout as I would be, in certain regards of an Ian Gary submission in there. I mean, if you're interested in making some money, might be worth an old double chance there. Let's move down to the 145-pound division. Fascinating matchup here, in my opinion. David Onama steps in to take on Giga Chikadze. Obviously, Chikadze coming off that last loss from Arnold Allen. Onama's been on a hell of a run. Obviously, Roberto Romero was the last time we've seen him in there. He picked up a unanimous decision win. We're getting a little bit of a jump up in competition here for Onama against a fairly technical striker in Chikadze, but a guy who is 36 years of age right now, Paul, and has had a topsy-turvy, obviously a couple of injuries since 2022. He's only had 3 fights, so he hasn't been that active. Coming towards the end of his tether here, it's a chance for Onama to kind of come in and get probably the biggest name on his record so far if he was to get the job done. Is it a wise move for Onama to stand and bang with a guy like Chikadze? I don't think so, but I think Onama does have the strength and power to be able to maybe take this fight down if he needs to. But it'll be interesting to see what the approach is here from Onama coming in. What do you think of this fight?
Yeah, and it may just be the right time to be getting Chikadze here, because like you mentioned there, he's around a while, 36. Won his first 7 fights when he signed for the UFC. Looked great, moved up and up in levels, and he beat a couple of veterans like Cub Swanson and who was it, Edson Barboza. And then he's lost 2 of the last 3, and they've been sort of spread out a little bit due to injuries. So, I mean, he's fought at a slightly higher level than Onama, but Onama maybe is just catching him at the right time here. Like, Onama's no joke either, and he's won his last 3 fights, albeit not fighting guys of the same caliber. But maybe this is the weekend where he gets that little bump up. Is Chikadze still ranked? I think he might be. We'll have a little nosy here at the rankings while I have them close by in front of
you're fighting
me.
Arnold Allen, yes. I would imagine that was a ranked versus ranked, so he's probably sitting at 14
12th.
or 15. 12th?
He's
nice.
12th in the featherweight rankings, so this is a great opportunity for David Onama.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Yeah, looking forward to seeing that one. Obviously, Onama, he's got that potential, and it looks like the trend setting up on a couple of these fights is kind of the young up and coming guy against the established talent in the division. And we can't say that about our next fight though, and that's Michel Pereira versus Abus Magomedov. I mean, Magomedov young and maybe in his UFC career, but definitely not young in his mixed martial arts career at 27-6-1, coming in here against Michel Pereira at 31-12. And we're just buckle up because we're going to be in for a bout of madness here, and that's the case every time Michel Pereira is in the octagon. Paul, are you expecting to see the same here against Abus Magomedov?
Yeah, like I mentioned at the start, they're bringing in the guys who put on the fun performances, and Jesus, he falls into that category. Since he moved up to the middleweight division, he won his first 3 fights, and then he was beaten last time out. So he's, that was his first loss, but he had been on a great run up to that. It was Fluffy Hernandez, wasn't it, that got the edge over him the last day out?
That's right.
No shame in that. Fluffy's a very good fighter, but he's looked pretty good since going up to the middleweight division. My concern this weekend would be that he's fighting Abus Magomedov, who is a very, very big middleweight, and if he's a guy who's coming up from the welterweight to the middleweight division and probably coming in at the maybe lower end of that sort of size spectrum for the guys in the 185-pound weight class, Abus Magomedov, just the way he fights, just the physicality, could that be too much for him? Like, obviously he's not going to be wanting to stand there having a fancy kickboxing match with Michel Pereira. He's going to try and get in his face and get a hold of him. Push
There's one word that kind of sticks in my mind, Paul, at this fight, and that's durability.
Yeah.
And I think when you match up to 2 of these guys, I think, when push comes to shove, if these guys do start banging, I do fancy Magomedov to have a little bit more durability. That if you can, we've seen with Michel Pereira, good hammer, not great nail at the best of times. And when you can put that pressure on him and you can do that damage, you can kind of take his confidence away and really, that's what happened in the last fight with Fluffy Hernandez. Fernandez just drowned him out. So I think the blueprint is there to beat a guy like Michel Pereira. But when he's standing in front of you, man, doing backflips and fucking somersaults and shit like that, it's hard to predict, and it's easy for me to say. But, I'm excited to see. This is a good matchup, this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's going to be a test. And like I said, the big test for Magomedov is, can you just get into I heard Liam Shannon in an interview call it recently the zone one, where you're clinched up, you're grappling, you're wrestling with your opponent, rather than zone 2, which is your boxing range, or zone 3, which is your kickboxing range.
Yeah.
Just shut down the space entirely. Do not let Michel Pereira do Michel Pereira things, because that's it's that's not a good recipe if you're the opponent. So yeah, that'll be the challenge for Magomedov. And like I mentioned, just the physicality, he may just have enough to do it this weekend.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that sentiment as well. Brandy Brown versus Nicholas Dalby at 170 is the next fight on the main card. Another fascinating matchup. I mean, Randy Brown is kind of like, Jekyll and Hyde sometimes with these performances. Can go out there and look absolutely tremendous. Can go out there and look like absolute shit sometimes as well. With Nicholas Dalby, what you see is what you get, and always what you see from Nicholas Dalby is just that tough, hard-nosed, walk-forward approach. I'm going to take your shots. You're going to have to take mine in return. Bloody wars we've seen Dalby in. He went on an impressive run. Obviously, his last fight against Rinat Fakhretdinov didn't go his way, lost a split decision. But in against a tough test here in Randy Brown, who himself is, has a topsy-turvy UFC career as well, coming off a loss to Brian Battle in his last fight by split decision. So both these guys looking to get back into the win column, and it's an interesting kind of stylistic matchup here, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, God bless Nicholas Dalby, 40 years old.
Crazy.
Since he had that break from the UFC, and he had those sort of well-documented struggles with his mental health, and he piled on a load of weight. But he came back into the UFC, and he has gone 6-2 with 1 no contest since his return to the UFC, even though he's now 40 years old. Like you mentioned there, he lost last June against Fakhretdinov, but prior to that, he had won 4 on the bounce, in his late 30s. So that's a guy who's really, really stringing impressive performances together. The one before the Fakhretdinov fight, wasn't that? Yeah, it was the Gabriel Bonfim, the big knockout as well. And
yeah, that was like a huge upset. Bonfim was coming in there highly, highly touted to kind of go on and do big things there, but Dalby said, "Not tonight, son." He said,
Dalby just has that dog in him. Yeah,
he does. He's that, like, you really have to get him out of there. Like when we were talking about durability in the last fight, Paul, Nicholas Dalby has that in abundance. But it has to be said, at 40 years of age, at some stage that durability does dwindle as you get on in your career. And it's going to happen sooner or later. Does it happen in this fight against a guy like Randy Brown? I don't know. I think Randy Brown is more of an awkward kind of, I wouldn't label him as a devastating striker, but he can devastate you if he sets up the right shot. It has to come off.
The knockout he got on Muslim
Yeah.
Salikov. You remember a couple of fights back, he absolutely sparked Muslim
And he kind
Salikov.
of sets it up.
No
I mean,
joke.
he's not going to hit you a one-punch knockout, but he does have the ability to tap it, then bang in with a big shot here. But he's going to have to produce something big if he wants to get Nicholas Dalby out of there on Saturday night for sure. Be interesting to see how he does as well. I think both of them flirting in and around the rankings there as well, so it'll be an interesting one to see. Last one on the main card then, Ikram Aleshkarov versus Andre Muniz. Interesting stylistic matchup in terms of a grappling perspective in this one for me. Obviously we've seen Aleshkarov go in there against Robert Whittaker. I believe that fight was on short notice. Lost early to Robert Whittaker. Fair play to him for taking that fight on short notice. Has had a couple of fights cancelled in between. I know this Muniz fight was supposed to happen in early February. It's been pushed back to this date. Interesting fight for two guys that, really kind of need to start making it happen in the division, especially when you're talking about a guy like Andrew Muniz as well, Paul. A guy who looked really good and then just kind of fell off the radar somewhat when he came up against elite level Well, I say elite. Brendan Allen and Paul Craig, somewhat elite level competition in terms of the names that he fought before that. But this is an interesting stylistic one. How do you see it going?
Yeah, I mean, when he submitted Jacare a couple of years back, we all thought, my God.
I was like, shit, we're off to the races here, man.
Yeah, and he won a couple more fights after that, Eric Anders and Uriah Hall. But then, like you mentioned, a couple of defeats. And then he did bounce back to the win column, but he hasn't fought in over a year now. Aleskarov had a first-round knockout in the Contender Series and then in both of his first 2 UFC fights. And then he fought Robert Whittaker. That was a very, very late notice. I think that was on fight week. And he was finished in the first round. So the kind of sample size that we've seen out of him, we've seen devastating finishes, but we've not really seen a lot else. So it's interesting. I'd like to see what these two guys look like if they're really pushing each other over the course of 10 or 15 minutes, and see what they're really made of. Alaskarov may have the potential to go on and do something big in this division. Muniz maybe is, if he's going to do it, he's got to do it now. We really need to see him maybe step up a couple of levels. But the submission game with Muniz is always a threat. But against that kind of Sambo style, sometimes that can be a difficult thing.
It worked for Muniz, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu style, until you got to a certain level where, you can see some of those attacks nullified as you get up the rankings a little bit too, where you're like, your straight Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu isn't going to really translate over to mixed martial arts. So he's got to find that fine line and making what works for him work in the fight too. And I'm interested to see if he can do that. I mean, I'd worry for him on the feet here. I'd worry that Aliskerov can kind of get in and get at him here and touch him a little bit and hurt him. I'm very interested to see if he can kind of get in there. So, like I said, lots of interesting stylistic matchups, and a pretty decent 6-fight main card as well. Won't go through the prelims in detail, Paul. Anything that tickles your fancy on the prelim section of the card?
The one that jumped out at me was Damon Blackshear fighting a Chinese fighter,
Alatang-Hili. Yeah.
So bantamweight fight. Damon Blackshear, he's an interesting one. He's the guy who got the twister on Jose Johnson there a couple of years back, and he's lost a couple of fights in the division, but like Mario Bautista, no shame in losing to him. He's proven himself to be one of the best bantamweights in the division.
I think he's definitely leveled up since those two defeats as well against Bautista and Jackson. Like, he looked really good against Damon and really good against Cody Gibson in his last fight too. And I think he has the ability to go out there and get it done against Alatang-Hili as well. Do you?
Yeah. Well, I'm looking through his record here, and the draw Yusuf Zalal, defeats to Farid Basharat, Batista, Montel Jackson. But then he's finished all the guys that he's beaten, 4 of them, a lot of them in the first round. I think two or three of them in the first round. Yeah. So he's going in there and he's putting on exciting fights, and maybe he's come up short against the really, really good guys. But yeah, I think he absolutely has enough in him to maybe get through this guy this weekend. This Chinese guy, he's kind of following he came in from the road to UFC, and he's following the pattern that a lot of Chinese fighters follow. He has a lot of fights under his belt. He's only 33 years old, and he's got 30 pro fights already, because what I noticed this when I was over there commentating for Brave, they all have massive records. They all fight very, very frequently. I've noticed
a couple of Chinese fighters for sure. Even a guy, the name escapes, but next time I see it, there's a guy who's like only 22 and 23. He's like 18 or 19 fights. I'm like, was this guy fighting out in nappies, or what was happening? It's crazy.
Yeah, they seem to just get them fighting every month or two over there.
Kind of like a Muay Thai kind of style. You're fighting every Tuesday and Thursday or something like that. But that catches up on you fairly quickly too, Paul, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And UFC experience is different,
Yeah, big time. I mean, nothing too much else really. I think Cameron Simon versus Malcolm Wellmaker is undefeated on the undercard as well. Matt Schnell, back from his probably 40th retirement, I think, is back against
Matt Schnell.
Matt Schnell.
Can you smell that smell?
Yeah, interesting to see. Look, he's always in fun fights, but is he in? Is he out? That's the big question. You can't be half-assing anything here. You're either fully committed or you're on the way out. And I almost want to say that he did retire late last year after his last fight again, didn't he?
Yeah, it lasted a couple of weeks.
Yeah, a couple of weeks and then back. Here you go. He's like, that gif of Abe Simpson going into the gentleman's club. That's Matt Schnell in and out of the 125-pound division against Jimmy Flick this Saturday night. That is it for our UFC preview. Obviously, a monster day of action in mixed martial arts, and in particular Irish mixed martial arts as well. Obviously, you have Cage Warriors during the day. In the wee hours of the morning, we have this UFC Kansas City card, obviously with Ian Garry topping the bill there. Anything to add before we finish her up, Paul? We all good?
I just cannot wait for Cage Warriors 188. I am so hyped for this card this weekend. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to it as well. Looking forward to seeing your coverage, seeing you there in action. I have serious FOMO for events like this myself. I'd love to be there too, but I will be watching from afar. I'll be helping out the crew. There'll be interviews on the ground, all of that kind of jazz going up on the website as well. So from Paul Brown and myself to everybody else, enjoy it,
is seeing this big fight feels, big event feels, Cage Warriors 188, followed by UFC Kansas City on Saturday. A mixed martial arts fans delight. Enjoy it. I'm looking forward to breaking down the fights already, whenever that may be. Who knows? But we'll be back again, likely next week, to break down some more UFC action. Thank you so much, Paul. Take care, everybody, and enjoy the fights this weekend.